Then both those comrades Thorkel and Halvard went out hastily, by the other doorway facing that by which they went in, and there outside stood Thorkel's men armed to the teeth. The Earl's men looked to him, but he was then dead, and the hands of all failed them to avenge him. Besides, it was all done in a hurry, for no man looked for such a deed from Thorkel. For they all thought that it would be, as was already agreed, that there should be friendship between the Earl and Thorkel. Most of the men too were weaponless who were inside the hall, and many of them good friends of Thorkel of yore. It happened too by that fate by which longer life was allotted to Thorkel. When Thorkel came out he had no less force than the Earl's men. Then Thorkel fared to his ship, but the Earl's men went away. Thorkel sailed away that day east into the sea, and that was after the winter had begun. Then they came safe and sound to Norway. Thorkel went at once to find King Olaf, and he got there a good welcome. The king showed himself well pleased at this deed. Thorkel was with him that winter. 19. After the falling away of Earl Einar, Earl Brussy took that lot of the lands which Earl Einar had before had. For it was with many men's witness on what terms Brussy and Einar had gone into partnership. It seemed most right to Earl Thorfinn that each of them should have half the isles. But still Brussy had that winter both lots of the isles. But the spring after Thorfinn laid claim to the land against Brussy, saying that he will have half the lands, but Brussy would not say yes to that. So they summoned meetings about those matters. Then their friends went about to settle the business, and so it came out not only that Thorfinn would let nothing else please him than to have half the isles, but he says at the same time that Brussy, with the temper he had no need of more than a tithing. I grudged not, says he Brussy, to have a tithing of the land which I took after my father as my heritage, and no one challenged my right to that. But now I have taken another tithing after my brother by lawful agreement. But though I am unable to strive in rivalry with you, kinsman, yet I will look to someone else rather than consent to give away my realm in such a way. When things had gone so far at that parley they parted. But when Brussy saw that he could not stand on even feet against Thorfinn, for that he had a much greater realm, besides the trust that he had in the Ska king, his mother's father, then he, Brussy, made up his mind to fare away out of the land east to find King Olaf, and he had with him his son Ragnvald, who was then 10 winters old. But when the Earl met the king, he gave him a good welcome. But when the Earl unfolded his errand, and tells the king the whole story of what had happened between his brother and himself, and begged the king to lend him strength to hold his realm, he offered him at the same time in return his entire friendship. The king answers, and began first to say how Harold Fairhair had owned all the allodial land in the Orkneys, but the earls have held it since in fief, but never as their owndom. And that is a token, says he, that when Eric Bloodaxe and his sons were in the Orkneys, then the earls were bound to do them service. But when Olaf, Tryggvi's son, my kinsman, came there, then Earl Sigurd, your father, made himself his man. Now I have taken all the heritage after him. Now I will make thee that choice that thou becomest my man. Then will I give over to thee the isles in fief. Then we too will try, if I lend thee my strength, whether it shall stand thee in better stead, or whether his trust in the Ska king, to thy brother Thorfinn. But if thou wilt not take this choice, then must I look after those rights and owndoms which I have held their way.
The Earl bore these sayings in his mind, and laid them before his friends, and asked counsel of them to what he should consent, and whether he should strike a bargain with King Olaf on those terms and become his man. But it is not at all plain to me what my lot will be when we part, if I say nay. For the king has made bare to me his claim, that he thinks he owns the isles. But with his boldness of purpose, and bearing in mind this too that we have come here, it will be a little thing for him to do just as he pleases with our affair.
But though the Earl found manifest fault with both courses, whichever way he went, still he took that choice to lay all in the king's power, both himself and his realm. Then King Olaf took from the Earl power and lordship over all his lands of heritage, and then the Earl was made the king's man, and bound that with oaths. 20. Earl Thorfinn learned that Brussi his brother had fared east to find King Olaf, to seek trust from him. But because Thorfinn had before fared to find King Olaf and got himself into friendship there, then he thought he had made it all right there beforehand, and knew that many there would back his cause. So Earl Thorfinn takes this counsel. He makes ready his voyage as speedily as he can and fared to Norway, and thought that he should make the passage almost as soon as Brussi, and that his errand would not be brought to an end. But when Thorfinn met the king, it was another way than he had thought. For when he came to see King Olaf, all that bargain between the king and Brussi was made and struck. Besides, Earl Thorfinn did not know that Brussi had given up his realm before ever Earl Thorfinn had come to see King Olaf. But as soon as they met, the Earl and King Olaf, then the king raised the same claim to the realm in the Orkneys which he had already made to Brussi, and bade Thorfinn do the same thing, that he should yield over to the king those lots of the lands which he already owned. The Earl answers well to the king's words, and spoke so as to show that he set great store on his friendship. And if ye, Lord, said the Earl, think that ye need my help against other chiefs, then ye have won it fully. But it is not in my power to yield you homage, for I am already the Scot king's Earl, and bound to do him service. But when the king found that there was drawing back in the Earl's answers as to this question which he had raised, then the king spoke. If thou, Earl, wilt not become my man, there is yet another choice, that I set that man up over the Orkneys whom I will, and my will then is that thou take oath to lay no claim to their lands, and to let them be in peace for thee whom I set up. But if thou wilt have none of these choices, then it must so seem to those whom I set up, as though strife were to be looked for them from thee. Then mayest thou not think it wonderful though the dale comes to meet the hill. The Earl answers, and bade the king give him time to think over that matter. The king did so, and gave the Earl time and leave to take counsel with his friends as to this. Then the Earl begged the king to grant him time till the next summer, and that he might fare home first of all. All my counselors are at home, he says, and I am but a child for my years' sake. But the king bade him choose one of the two courses there and then. Thorkel Fosterer was then with the king. He sent men stealthily to the Earl, and besought him not to think, whatever might be on his mind, of parting so with King Olaf that they were not good friends. Just when he had put himself in the king's hands, Thorkel thought he could see that the only choice left him was to let the king have his will in everything. It seemed to them Thorkel and his friends, though not at all a good choice, to have no hope one's self of one's heritage, and to take an oath to the effect that they might have that realm in peace who were not born to it. But because that he thought it uncertain about his going away, then he made the choice to give himself over into the king's hand, and become his man as his brother Brussi had done. The king found out that Thorfinn was of a much higher spirit than Brussi, and for that sake he trusted Thorfinn less. The king saw too that he would think he might look for strength from the Scot king, even though he broke this agreement. The king understood that out of his wisdom. Brussi went unwillingly into all the agreement, but spoke nothing but what he meant to hold. But where Thorfinn was he went gladly at everything. As soon as ever he had made up his mind what part he should take, then he went gladly into every condition, and did not stickle in the least at what the king asked the first evening. But the king doubted that he must mean to go back on some of his undertakings. 1. That is by witchcraft. 2. The true text here is preserved only in the Danish translation. In its place Florida has a long chapter out of the saga of King Olaf, Tvigvi's son, as contained in FMS. That chapter will be found in the appendix. 3. Thus, according to the chronology of the Icelandic writers, it was in reality 14 years afterwards. 4. The Florida begins here a new section of the saga, thus, the chapter of those ORKNEYINGERS. A mighty man of war in the Orkneys was Earl Einar, Earl Sigurd's son. He was thought no fair man. He warred in Ireland, etc. 5. Loch Larn in Ireland. 6. Now Osmondsall in the Orkneys. 7. In the original Sparta, some sort of bill or poleaxe. The word occurs as spart or spurt in medieval lists of arms in England. See Hist.com. Report for 1877. IP. 491. 8. A proverb meaning that Thorfinn must not be surprised if the natural result followed. 9. In the Runic Lex. The whole passage runs thus: Earl Thorfinn said, as was true, that most of his counselors were at home. 10. The sentence in brackets is a repetition. 21. When King Olaf had thought over with himself the whole matter, he let them blow the trumpets for a great gathering of men, and made them call both the earls thither. Then he spoke thus: I will now declare before the whole people the settlement between the Orkney earls and myself. They have now agreed to my absolute right over the Orkneys and Shetland, and made themselves my men, and bound that with oaths, and I will now give them in fief. To Brassy one trything, and to Thorfinn another as they have had before. But that trything which Earl Einar owned, that I make fall to me, for that sake that he slew Evinturarn, my henchman and dear brother in arms. For that lot of the lands, I will take care as I think good. That, too, I lay on both ye brethren, my earls, that ye take an atonement from Thorkel, Amund's son, for the slaying of your brother Einar. And I wish to lay down the terms of the atonement, if ye will say yes to that. But it was now as it was in other things. They said yes to everything the king said. Then Thorkel went forward and bound himself by the king's award, and so that thing broke up. King Olaf awarded an atonement for Earl Einar as though for 3 king's sons, but for cause given a trything of the fine was to fall to the ground. Earl Thorfinn begged leave of the king to go away, but as soon as he got that he busked him speedily. But when he was all bound, it fell upon a day when the earl was a-drinking on his ship, that there came to him stealthily Thorkel Amund's son, and laid his head upon his knees, and bade him do with it as he would. The earl asked why he did so, now that we are already set at one by the king's doom. Stand up, pray. He did so, and said, that atonement which the king made between us I may trust between Brassy and me. But so far as you have any share in it, you alone shall have your way. Though the king has awarded me my estates and right to stay in the Orkneys, still I know your frame of mind so well that I can never go into the Isles unless I fare thither on your good faith. I will bind myself to you, he says, never to come to the Orkneys, whatever the king may have said about that. The earl held his peace, and was slow to speak, and then he spoke thus: Wilt thou, Thorkel, that I speak my doom about our matter, and not rest on the king's doom? Then must I have this beginning of our atonement, that thou shalt fare with me to the Orkneys, and be with me, and never part from me, unless thou hast my leave. That thou shalt be bound to guard my land, and do all things that I will have done so long as we two both live. Thorkel answers, That shall be in your power, Lord, as well as everything else in which I may have any voice. Then Thorkel went up to Earl Thorfinn, and bound himself to the earl in everything that the earl laid down. The earl says that he will utter his doom as to the payment of the fine for Einar afterwards, but he took there and then oaths from Thorkel, and he turned him then at once to fare away with the earl. Then the earl fared away at once, as soon as ever he was bound, and he and King Olaf never saw each other more. Earl Brassy stayed then after him and took more time to busk himself. But ere he fared away, King Olaf had a meeting with him, and said, It looks to me, Earl, that I am like to have thee for a faithful liegeman there away over the western sea. And so I purpose that thou shalt have 2 lots of the lands to rule over, those 2 I mean which thou hadst of yore. and my will is that thou shouldest not be a less man, nor a less powerful, now that thou hast given thyself into my hand, than thou wast before. But I will clench thy faithfulness with this, that I will that thy son Ragnvald be here behind. I see then, if thou hast any trust and 2 lots of the lands, that thou mayest well hold thy own by right against Earl Thorfinn. Brussi took that with thanks to have 2 lots of the lands. Brussi stayed there a little while longer ere he fared away, and came about autumn west to the Orkneys. Ragnvald, Brussi's son, stayed behind with King Olaf. He was of all men fairest. His hair was full and yellow, like silk. He was soon tall and strong. The most perfect man was he both for wit's sake and courtesy. He was long with King Olaf. Otter the Black makes mention of these things in that ode which he made on King Olaf. Among Tithans are reckoned bold lads of Hyalte's land. Thou gotten hast a handy realm. Of princes of the people, there was no king on earth. Ere thou camest, warlike lord, who underneath his yoke could bow. Those islands of the west, when those brothers came west to the Orkneys, Thorfinn and Brussi, then Brussi took 2 lots of the lands under his lordship, but Thorfinn a tithing. He was ever in Caithness and Scotland, but set up his men over the isles. At that time Brussi alone kept watch and ward over the isles. But in that time they were much warred on, for Northmen and Danes harried much in the west, sea roving, and came often to the isles when they fared west, or from the west, and seized this or that mess. Brussi complained that Thorfinn had no force out to guard the Orkneys or Shetland, but kept the scats and dues all to his share. Then Thorfinn made him that offer, that Brussi should have a tithing of the lands, but Thorfinn 2 lots, and alone keep watch and ward over the land. But though this arrangement was not made all at once, yet at last this settlement came about, that Brussi had a tithing and Thorfinn 2 lots. This was when Canute had rule in Norway, but Olaf had been forced to fly out of the land. 22. Earl Thorfinn made himself a great chief. He was the tallest and strongest of men, ugly, black-haired, sharp-featured, and big-nosed, and with somewhat scowling brows. He was a mighty man of strife, and greedy both of money and honor. He was lucky in battle, and skillful in war, and good in onslaught. He was then 5 winters old when Malcolm the Scot king, his mother's father, gave him the title of Earl and Caithness as his lordship, as was written above. But he was 14 winters when he had war levies out of his land, and harried on the realms of other chiefs. So says Arn Earl's Scald. The king amid the crash of helms died at his broadsword's edge. 15 winters he had filled. Reddner of Raven's Feet, brave chief, of Einar's brothers last. Lands good to win and guard, he proved himself a properer man. Is no man neth the sky? Earl Thorfinn had much strength from his kinsman the Scot king. It was a great help to his power in the Orkneys that strength was so near. The Scot king breathed his last just when those brothers, Brussi and Thorfinn, were set at one again. Then Karl Houndson took the rule over Scotland. He thought he ought to own Caithness too, like the former Scot kings. And he would have scat from that part of the realm as from other places, but Earl Thorfinn thought he had not too great a heritage after his mother's father, though he had Caithness. He said that realm had been given to him, and he would pay no scat for it. Now out of this arose a mighty feud, and each harried the other's realm. King Carl would set up in Caithness a chief, whose name was Mumden or Mudden. He was his sister's son, and he gave him the title of Earl. Then Mudden rode down on Caithness, and gathered force together in Sutherland. Then news came to Earl Thorfinn, and then he drew together a host all over Caithness. There came 2 out from the Orkneys Thorkel Fosterer, with much force to meet the Earl. Then Thorfinn fared to meet Mutton, and had then the greater host. And as soon as the Scots knew that they had fewer men, they would not fight, and rode up back to Scotland. Then Earl Thorfinn fared after them and laid under him Sutherland and Ross, and harried far and wide over Scotland. Thence he turned back to Caithness, but Thorkel went out to the Isles. The levies of the people also went home. The Earl stayed in Caithness at Duncansby, and had there 5 long ships, and just so much force as was enough to man them well. Mutton came to see King Carl in Berwick, and tells him how his paths had not been smooth. King Carl then got very wrath when he learned that his land was harried. He went then at once on shipboard, and had 11 long ships and much people. Then he held on north along Scotland. Mutton he sent back to Caithness with a great force, and he rode the upper way through Scotland. It was so settled that he should come down thence, and then Thorfinn would be in a cleft stick. Now it must be told of Carl that he never slackened sail before he came to Caithness, and then there was scant space between him and Thorfinn. Then Thorfinn took that counsel to go on shipboard and hold out into the Pentland Firth, and he meant to go to the Orkneys. By that time there was so scant space between them, that Carl and his men saw Thorfinn's sails as he sailed east across the firth, and they sailed after them at once. Thorfinn and his men had not seen their sails, and so east he steered along the Isles, and meant to go to Sandwich. He ran in from the east under Dearness, and sent word at once to Thorkel that he should gather force together. Brassy had the northernmost lot of the Isles, and was then there. Thorfinn lay under Dearness, as was written before, and had come thither late. But next morning when it was light, the first thing they found out was that Carl and his men were rowing up to them with 11 ships. There were then 2 choices on hand. The one was to jump ashore and leave the ships and all his goods to his foes. The other is to put out to meet them and then let destiny have her sway. Thorfinn called then on his men, and bade them get out their weapons. He said he would not run away, and bade them row against them manfully. And after that each side lashed their ships together. Earl Thorfinn egged on his men much, and bade them be hot, and make the first bout hard. As for the Scots, he said few of them would stand. This fight was both hard and long, and it was long before it could be seen which way the day would turn. Of this battle Arner makes mention in Thorfinn's ode. At last I trow our Lord hath taught to mail-linked Carl a lesson, away east off Dearness. The prince's rule prospered. With war snakes 5 the wrathful chief rushed gainst 11 of the king, and hating flight himself held on his course with constant heart. The seamen laid their ships aboard,